Continuing the journey.
Just film it for a bit, you can, stick a bit of it in. Oh, echidna, quick.
Whoa.
Come around. Get up, you get up close to him.
That's an echidna right there, guys. Do you see its little spikes?
So as we can see, it's using its defensive behaviours here, half burying itself and just exposing its spikes. So it doesn't make a very appealing kind of a meal to anything.
Oh, this is epic. Let's continue though.
Cool.
Let it be.
These spread out throughout here, like the blooms are, you can just see them over there, they're just coming to the end of their season. This is the yellow marsh flower.
Oh yeah.
And all of these things, when we first dug this out, it was just a raw hole in the ground. And all of these plants, all of these seeds found their own way in. So plants have all sorts of strategies for getting their seed around. So some of them would have come in on water birds, some of them would have blown in on the wind, some of them would have washed in with floods. Others would have still been there in the soil from the previous ephemeral wetland that was here. Others would have caught in the coats of mammals and found their way in that way.
Yeah.
So they have strategies for getting around, and when they find the right environment for them, as in obviously water plants, wetland plants like wetlands, so if the seed ends up somewhere that's not that environment, it won't germinate and grow, but if it ends up in the right place, it will germinate and grow. And here we've got a whole ecosystem that's just formed from things that have found their own way in.
Very pretty.
And it is very pretty.
Oh, are those fish feeding at the surface or something?
There'll be all sorts of, here's just a little diving beetle down there. But we could have, if we scoop nets through here, we'd find all sorts of things. And we have little pygmy perch and bony perch in here as well, little native fish.
Yeah.
And we often get the long-nosed, the long-necked, eastern long-necked tortoise around here.
Cool.
There's another dam over here where I've seen about 7 or 8 of them all at once, sticking their little heads up.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah, before we were talking about how we'd created a permanent wetland from an ephemeral wetland over there.
Yeah.
And this area here is what we call part of an ephemeral wetland. So this was sort of under a thin layer of water in winter, and we can see it's still really quite moist here. And we're nearly to the end of December. It's Boxing Day.
Yeah.
And these plants here, these little orchids, they're called leek orchids. They have a tiny little flower on the end of each of these spikes here, each of these little knobs sticking out. And they only grow in these sort of conditions where you get somewhere that's been inundated in shallow water over winter and then dries out, and you get this moist soil in the early summer. And you get this really nice dark peaty soil with the accumulate peaty soil. Peaty Pete with his peaty soil. And this is all the organic matter that accumulates in the water over time in these little depressions. So if we film over this way, Laz, you see we've got a shallow basin here. We've got a ridge going around it with the trees growing on it, and then into it we've got these, you can see the slope of the Melaleuca, which is that really tightly packed bush there, the tightly packed trees. So it's just basically one one or two trees originally, and they send out suckers, or they send out rhizomes, which are like horizontal roots, and then they send up trunks from each of those, and they're gradually colonising into this wetland, and they'll go into a certain point and then they'll stop where it gets too wet for them, or they might colonise the whole thing. It just depends. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's all come back since we stopped having cattle on here over 20 years ago or something. And then you can see the reeds in the middle. So you can tell by, by the lay of the land, but also by the plants that grow there, where it's wet and where it's not.
Yeah.
So the Eucalyptus prioriana, or the coastal manigum, won't grow where it's too wet, but there are other eucalypts that will grow there, and we'll have a look at those too. So we'll head into here and see what we find.
Okay.
So here we've got this black peaty soil that accumulates in these low-lying areas. And what it also does is it compacts together, and it can create a layer that's impermeable to water. And then that actually creates the bottom for the wetland itself. And sometimes you also get, and we did have some around here, what are called perched lakes, where in a sand dune you get this accumulation of organic matter like this that turns into a peat layer that the water can't penetrate, and then it creates a lake high in the sand dunes above the water table. So the water table is where the water flows through the ground and reaches a layer of rock or a layer of clay or something that it can't penetrate, and then as the rain soaks into the soil it gradually builds up and it might come through the surface eventually. But these perched lakes that form on peat in sand dunes and depressions like this can actually be above the water table and just accumulate rainwater on their own.
Oh yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Some of these white marsh flowers, and again these are things that grow after a wetland dries out. So these are ephemeral wetland adapted plants. And we'll see over here we've got more of the leek orchids. Okay.
Yep.
And we'll go down to the river mint. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so these little mounds of soil here that are basically piles of little lumps about that size. They're actually holes that have been excavated by the Gippsland land crab or land crayfish, which is a little critter, a crayfish type critter about that long.
Yeah, I'll show a picture of it just now.
Okay, and they'll live in soil that's damp, or even in a shallow wetland, but they or around the edges of a wetland. So they live in forests up in the hills here, quite high up in the hills, just as long as it's damp enough and their burrow stays moist. That's where they'll live. So again, they like these wet areas, these ephemeral wetlands where the waters come and go and the soil stays moist beneath. In this sort of country, in a wet forest, they'll just live in the ground of the forest where it stays wet in the gullies, under the tree ferns and places like that.
Fascinating.
And what we also have here is a native mint, and this only grows where it's been flooded previously, and it's a really nice plant for making tea with. It smells of, it's like peppermint, and it's indigenous mint, and it only grows in ephemeral wetlands like this. So in winter this is underwater, and this comes up in summer or late spring when the wetland dries out.
This is all mint. All here.
So that's a better one. That's more like a chimney shape. So that's a classic chimney shape, because they're called chimneys, these little constructions that the land crabs make.
Yeah.
You can See the mint all through here.
I'm going to do it.
Okay, so there's our ephemeral wetland montage. We've got the mint, we've got the crayfish burrow, and here we've got a big leek orchid, which might be a slightly different species maybe. Seems to have got a lot bigger, or maybe it's just in better conditions here.
That's a land crab
Yep.
chimney.
Yep.